Our next speaker is Cecilia Elena Rouse, president of the Brookings Institution and the Katzman-Ernst Professor of Economics and Education at Princeton University. Prior to becoming president of Brookings, she was on leave to serve as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden administration. She received both her undergraduate and her doctoral degrees from Harvard University. Policymakers and economists disagree about many things, but they generally concur that higher education yields positive economic benefits. To reap those benefits, it is important to increase access to and completion of higher education. While both goals should improve economic mobility and boost the U.S. economy, they've been difficult to achieve. Dr. Rouse will discuss how education policy has evolved over time, interventions that have been attempted, continuing challenges, and how they may be managed. Elected to Class 5's section on economic sciences, Dr. Rouse's title is Improving Access and Completion, Elusive Goals in American Higher Education.
Well, at one level, I feel like she's given my talk, so maybe I can just sit down. But in all seriousness, it is an honor to be here. And in the short time we have together, I will describe a little bit of my journey. And like with many of the talks, I understand there's actually a podcast you have for the National Academy of Sciences, which is I Was Born, and I feel like that should have been my first slide. But in the beginning, like many, I come from those before me, and I'm particularly been affected by my parents. So this is Dr. Carl A. Rouse and Lorraine Rouse, who were both very deeply dedicated to the value of education. My dad was the first Black to receive a PhD in physics from Caltech, and my mom was one of 3 daughters, and my grandfather sent all of them to college, much to the dismay of his family. So they strongly believed in the value of education. They felt it afforded them much opportunity, it afforded them financial stability. They instilled in all 3 of their children the joy of inquiry and a love of learning, such that all 3 of us went on to earn PhDs. My brother has a PhD in high energy physics. My PhD is in economics, and my sister has a PhD in visual anthropology, and she's my colleague. She's a professor of anthropology at Princeton. So my love of education and my values from education very much stem from my family, and you may say, that's great, Rouse, but what does that have to do with your research? So let's go ahead and get to it. So as was noted, many economists don't agree about many things, but there is this stylized fact, which is that education generally pays. There are many ways we could illustrate this. What I've done here is show, for full-time workers, we could do this we don't have to do just full-time workers, average annual earnings, actually I think it's median, and just did the ratio of those with different levels of post-secondary education to those with just a high school degree. So put a line at 1, because at 1 they're equal. Any numbers above 1 suggest that the post-secondary schooling is paying off. And I've got 3 levels of schooling here, those with some college, which in this graph is those who have started college but did not get a degree, a 4-year degree in this case, and those who only have a bachelor's degree and those who have a bachelor's degree and maybe more, many of the people in this room. So you can see that going back to 1940, with the exception of the period between roughly 1950 and 1970, even for those who start college but don't complete a degree, that there is some return to going to school. And you see in particular for those with a bachelor's degree or higher, the return is much higher. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that it really starts to take off in the 1980s. So I was in graduate school in the late 80s and early 90s, and this increase really caught the attention of economists. That increase, we think, is largely due to technological change, to increased competitiveness. And so there had been some interest in the economic value of education beforehand, and it had gone somewhat dormant, and it was very much re-energized around this time. And so one of my thesis advisors, Larry Summers, said, as I was flopping around for a thesis topic, suggested that I try to understand why different states have different returns to schooling by looking at things like their manufacturing base, the number of students that went to school, to college, the average income. And I'm collecting all this data by hand. And I'm looking in the library, collecting data by hand on how many people are going to college. And I noticed that when we thought about college and when they were looking at the data, there was those who went to 2-year college and those who went to 4-year college. But in these data, when we say college, we just say college, because most data sets don't distinguish between a 2-year college and a 4-year college. And most economists assumed that when we said college, we meant a 4-year college. And so I came from California. I used to, in one version of the slides, I had a map of all the community colleges. California has many community colleges. And I thought, most people from California, including my main thesis advisor, Larry Katz, he took a class on dinosaurs. I took typing, that dates me, but most people have been to college, have been to a community college. And so the question was, wow, is that a good assumption that people, when we say college, we mean a 4-year college? And so I set out to understand that. And it turns out not so much. Especially, so this graph shows in yellow, it is the percentage of first-time undergraduates that are in a 2-year college. And I will use the terms 2-year college and community college somewhat interchangeably. There's some small distinctions between the two, but it's roughly a school which the highest degree is an associate's degree, a 2-year degree. So you can see that the percentage of first-time students, especially in the time that I was studying this, was around 45%. So almost half of students, when they were starting college, were starting at a 2-year college. And you can see that somewhere around 40%, even higher than that, periods of time of all undergraduates were in a 2-year college. And yet we knew very little at that time about the economic value of going to a community college or a 2-year college versus a 4-year college. And so, my thesis team, Larry Katz and Claudia Golden and Larry Summers as well, encouraged me to go ahead and see if I could find a data set that would allow me to look at 2-year colleges versus 4-year colleges and see what I could learn. So my main dissertation work was focused on 2-year colleges. Claudia Golden came up with the title of my dissertation. I'm going to give her the hat tip there. We called it the other college because it really was not in the minds of economists. I did work with Tom Kane, who's an economist at Harvard University, where we had longitudinal data from the high school class of 1972, and we could see since it was longitudinal, they were tracked. And it was from the Department of Education, so they also gathered credits from their schooling along the way, and we could see credits in 2-year colleges versus 4-year colleges. And so we regressed, so we looked at the relationship between their hourly wages and the number of credits they had. So I have the circle around, we did the total number of credits at a 2-year college divided by 30, because roughly 30 college credits is about a year. And you can see that the coefficients are roughly the same between the 2-year college and the 4-year colleges, and that was the same for both men and women. So roughly, for every year of credits, that would increase hourly wages by about 5%. And there's a little F test there for those who want to really study the table to suggest that they're statistically very similar. So we concluded that the credit was roughly a credit, and so we could understand why many policymakers and many researchers really understood the value of going to school, and especially going to a post-secondary institution, which is why there has been such focus on access. And so, who's going to argue that we shouldn't be providing opportunity to go to college? And much of higher education policy up to this point had really focused on increasing access. And I'm going to say here, we have done a pretty good job. I'm not going to declare mission accomplished, but we've done a pretty good job. What this graph shows you is the proportion or the percentage of the adult age population that has these different levels of schooling. Here, some college is actually college, but no degree at all, because I've got actually data in these data of the associate's degree, the 2-year degree. But it shows the percentage of the population, of the adult population with each year of schooling. And it's indexed to 1992 to make it easier to see where there's been increase and where there's been decrease. And so anything below 100% suggests there's been a decrease. So you can see that a decreasing percentage of the population has less than a high school degree or some college and no degree. And that we've seen increases in the percentage of the population with some degree, associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or a graduate degree. So this is pretty stunning. The percentage of the American population spend a college that attended some college was about 45% in 1960. It's about 62% or so around now. About 19 million students are enrolled in a post-secondary institution. So again, I'm not going to declare mission accomplished, but we have seen some improvements in access. But that's not the full story of educational attainment, because students start, but what do they actually complete? And I first got focused on this in this work I was doing with Tom Kane, because again, we had data on the credits that students were earning. And what we did when we graphed the number of credits, so these are credits earned by students who attended any two-year institution in these data. And you can see that about 35% of the students only completed a semester or less when they started. Around half completed 1 year or less, and there's significant drop-off. That's in comparison. I didn't bring the distribution for four-year colleges using those data, but if we look at completion rates even pulling through to today, this is the graduation rates 150% of the program time. So an associate degree typically takes 2 years. So this is, have you received an associate degree after 3 years? And for the four-year degree, where we have, it's usually 4 years. So this is after 6 years. We can see that the graduation rates are much higher for four-year institutions than 2-year, and it's been fairly flat. So what's going on with two-year institutions? Why the high rate of non-completion? So one explanation is the complicated lives that two-year college students tend to have. So if you look at students who are in a 4-year not-for-profit institution, most of them, I think it's like, the majority of them are what we would call a traditional student. They are roughly 18 years old. They're dependent on their parents for financial support. If you look at two-year students, something like 13% are such students. Rather, you have students who've delayed entry into college. They are financially independent. They have children or dependents of their own. They're attending part-time. Their lives are just more complicated. And I'm not going to say much more about that per se, but what that does, if you ask me, is that it makes all of these other interventions that we try to do much more complicated. So if we think about their academic preparation, if we think about whether the curriculum is effective, the lack of institutional support and cost, where I'm going to end unless I run out of time, it gets much more complicated with their complicated lives. So let's start with academic preparation. Remedial education is a bit of a proxy. And you can see that just under a third of students, first-year students, take a remedial class. And that's twice as high in public institutions, 2-year or 4-year, as there is in private institutions. The problem here is, so that suggests that a significant fraction of students that are going to these, go to post-secondary institutions are not really prepared to just jump into a college-level class. It's expensive. We spend about $1.3 billion every year on remedial education, and it's not that particularly effective. There's some evidence to suggest that it helps students get through school, it helps them get a bachelor's degree or get some kind of degree. Other evidence suggests it actually slows down the degree. The evidence is mixed. Remedial education on its own isn't doing the trick. So what if we were to enhance the remedial education? So one potential intervention that I worked with researchers at MDRC, which is a research organization in New York City that really specializes in doing randomized evaluations to understand these kinds of interventions, is we looked at the impact of learning communities. So learning communities is a way to enhance the academic engagement and social engagement for students at institutions where they don't naturally have a cohort. So a group of students in a learning community will take 2 or more classes together, and then the instructors in the 2 classes actually try to coordinate and link up, so there's subject matter coordination, and so that to enhance some of the academic engagement. So at Kingsborough Community College, all of the students were assigned to a remedial class, and then they were taking another class together. So what we saw was it did increase the number of courses attempted, at least in the short run, help students pass courses. In the longer run evidence, it doesn't seem to really help with completion. It does help them accumulate a few more credits, but in and of itself, it's not going to do the trick. MDRC said, what if we make it bigger? So what if we have learning communities, but we're going to supplement that with some financial support and high-touch advising and tutoring, and we're going to require the students to attend full-time, and we're going to insist that they really concentrate their remedial education, their developmental education, and get through it. Here we started to see the first bits of progress. So this is a program called ASAB, Associate Program Improvement, Accelerated Study and Associate Program. They did it in 2 sites, 1 at CUNY, 3 in Ohio. And you can see that graduation rates are roughly double for those who participate in the program, and they also accumulate many more credits. So we can see that these more comprehensive approaches are the more productive way to improve completion. Okay, tuition, and I'm gonna speed through this in my 30 seconds that I have left. Well, I'm gonna take a couple more minutes. So we focus on tuition because we can see it and many people worry about it. Many people, we see the sticker price, so that is the published tuition price for a university, and we know that that has been increasing faster than inflation over many years. And here you can see the growth between 2006 and 2024. What we don't see at the same time is that there's been a huge increase in the number of students getting financial aid. So over the same time period, we went from about 75% of students receiving any financial aid to about 87%. And while student loans have taken up a bigger percentage, at least between the earlier part of this chart when about 40% of financial aid was composed of student loans, which increased to about 44% at the start of the financial crisis, that has actually shrunk to about 24%. With an increase in institutional grants. So we see students increasingly reliant on grants, but we see increases in financial aid. So if you strip out the financial aid and you actually ask what are students paying on net, what we actually see is that there's been a decrease in the net price that students are paying over this time. In fact, on average, students going to a 2-year college are getting a return, meaning that their grants are helping to pay for some other expenses. Okay, so tuition likely isn't just in and of itself going to be a problem, but we then said with this increasing reliance on grants, can we make those more effective by trying to provide an incentive in them? So we call these performance-based scholarships, and we said, well, what if we make it that in order to get a little extra on your scholarship, you have to have a certain grade point average, be enrolled a certain amount of time. And just in the interest of time, I will say that these seem to have a small impact on credits accumulated, a little bit on degree completion. It's a cost-effective, also not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve it. Okay, so we see a lot of grant aid, but what's really a focus, and we don't really know how to make it much more effective, but what has really ballooned over the last several years, decades, is student debt. It's gotten a lot of attention, and many people are very concerned about it. So one of the things that distinguishes me is I've done 3 tours serving presidents, President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden. As I was working with President Biden and President Obama at the Council of Economic Advisors, we were very focused on student debt. And so at the beginning of the Obama administration, in particular, we were concerned about where are students going to college and which students are not, and which institutions are not performing. The panel on the left shows that enrollment change, so where's there been an increase in enrollment, by whether the school is like one of the worst performing schools in terms of student repayment. Students aren't repaying if they're not actually getting a lot of value add out of their program. And you can see that the biggest increases in enrollment were in the worst performing schools. The nub is that if you look at where first generation students were going to school, they were overwhelmingly seeing their increases at these low performing schools. And these low performing schools, there was a very large overlap with them being for-profit institutions. So a major focus of trying to address student loans has been trying to increase accountability, especially in the for-profit sector for occupational programs. So under President Obama, a lot of the focus was on something in the Higher Education Act, which requires occupational programs to show gainful employment. It's a theoretically beautiful way to go about this problem, and it did actually result in several hundred institutions or programs closing. It's not going to survive the current administration. It didn't survive during the prior administration, prior Trump administration. But it's one way to try to address, how do we allow grants and loans for students, so giving them that access, with also having some accountability by the institutions. Another way we can approach this is income-driven repayment. We economists think of higher education in particular as an investment. And so investments are risky. You're paying up front, and then you expect a return afterwards. But not everybody is lucky enough to earn a well-paying job, and we want some people to go into jobs may not pay a lot, but are socially quite valuable. So, for example, Congress passed an income-driven repayment program, which allows people who are not earning quite as much as they might have expected to caps how much they pay, and it forgives it entirely after about 15, 20 years. So that's another way to approach it. And finally, we have loan forgiveness. Congress passed in 2007 a public sector loan program, and that has been very important, especially for public school teachers. In sum, post-secondary education, including two-year institutions, have been a very important avenue for individuals to improve their economic outcomes. We've made progress in terms of access. We have a lot of challenges in terms of completion. I think in terms of completion, I think the most promising programs are the more comprehensive ones that deal with the whole student. And in terms of financial aid, a really effective system that both subsidizes students, but without overburdening students with debt remains a work in progress. So thank you.
Thank you. That's terrific. Maybe one or two questions. I think I've scared people off. There we go.
Hi there. My name is Diane O'Brien. I'm at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Alaska is a really interesting state from the point of view of higher education. It's really complicated. Thank you so much for the interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question was about the ASAP program that you described that had such great success. And one of the details of it, though, was that you required full-time. And I'm just curious whether how you disentangle the effectiveness of the program from the filter.
It was a randomized experiment. So at least initially, the students had to be willing and signed up to be full-time students. Obviously, that, if you're in the program, they were obligated to remain full-time students. That is some of the degradation in the control group. But to begin with, they were all signing up for exactly that understanding, and then they were randomized into treatment and control groups.
Okay, I was just wondering about that. Kind of cuts out the people that can't do full-time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Parenting.
And for two-year students, that's a lot of students. So that's not a complete solution for the entire sector. Right.
And maybe one more quick question.
Thank you for the talk. That was great. I wanted you to maybe comment on why education is not paying off for women as much as it does for men. So we have in Australia, and also I think in the US, higher rates of women completing a bachelor degree, and yet when it comes to earnings, we have a very stubborn, possibly even declining gender wage gap.
Yeah, one of the features of the gender wage gap in the United States is just out of college, actually it's not very large, but it does tend to open up and it gets very entangled into life choices and occupational choices. Claudia Golden has been studying this a lot. You can see that there's a bigger gap. Women are more likely to take jobs that allow them to balance family care, child care, elder care with work, so they take jobs that are more flexible, which there's a trade-off in terms of the wages. So, again, if you look at very young women and men, there's not as much of a gap. Some of this is much bigger than our educational system per se.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.